And unfortunately, what we're seeing is I think a lot of this has been lost, and a lot of it seems like the last 10 years or so. There are very few filmmakers who are actually connecting external conflict to internal conflicts.
What does the subconscious have to do with story?
Oh man, that's a great question. So in the end, okay, so we talked about the difference between a story and a narrative, right? And I mean, the best way to look at it would be, we talked about Jonathan Haidt's distinction between, the elephant rider, the conscious mind, the elephant rider, and the unconscious, the elephant. Ultimately, the unconscious is, in my book, The Story Ritual, Character Arcs and Rites of Passage, I do a deep dive into, I kind of drill into this concept of what is the unconscious composed of? And I tried to pull from, Jung and definitely Jonathan Haidt, his moral matrix definitely informed a lot of it, as well as How Emotions Are Made. It's this amazing book that talks about like the development of like what actually is an emotion and how our mind works. It's about the process of cognition. Anyways, so what I do is in the story ritual, let me just show this to you.
Oh yeah, please. And there's such beautiful illustrations. You did all these?
Yeah, so these are all my illustrations. My entire career, I worked as a character designer, concept artist, and storyboard artist, which is I would love to talk about the industry if we get some time for it. But I've worked as an artist my entire career, and story is it's kind of like the umbrella that carries all the other art forms. Character design, storyboarding, concept art. All of that comes down to story and why we want to care so much about story. But in the book, I tried to come up with like simple, clear illustrations, strongly influenced by my, one of my favorite mediums of manga. And I came up with here's actually the Jonathan Haidt elephant rider metaphor. But I tried to illustrate the way the subconscious works. And I tried to come up with an illustration of the collective unconscious and how ultimately the unconscious is kind of broken down into like several tiers. There's the personal unconscious, which a lot of people forget about that. A lot of psychologists actually really struggle to grapple with this idea. That's why I think, I think I can help a little bit with the illustrations, because the one thing I'm strong at, I think, is building models or visual models that kind of make sense, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I came up with this, with visual representations of how the unconscious works. And ultimately, the unconscious is a kind of, each one of us has like different degrees. Like there's the sacred at the core of it. There's the practical, which is the beliefs that we navigate around the world. And then there's the peripheral. And all these beliefs are organized in kind of a tree. And this tree, like these tree of beliefs, so like every single branch is a series of beliefs. And ultimately a story is usually addressing one branch of those beliefs. And what that is, if you imagine that, like in the book, I talk a little bit about the sacred and the profane, these different spheres of values. A belief isn't just a story, it's a story that has emotional value. And it's the value that drives us to act, to perform. That's how you can always know what somebody really believes, not by what they're saying, but by what they're doing. It's a big reason why so many people in story try and say, like, this isn't, you know your character by what they're doing, not because of the things they're telling you. In fact, most of the time, the things they're saying is a mask, and it's a mask that they're not aware of. So most story is there to push them through conflicts that start to pull off their masks until they reveal their deeper beliefs. So if you look at a tree and you start at the very end of a branch, the conflicts, you see these lower order beliefs. I'm probably speaking really abstractly. You get the book, it makes a lot of sense. But each belief connects to each other. And as we go through these conflicts, the beliefs are slowly kind of dismantled or challenged until we get to a core belief that anchors the identity of the protagonist. And that's really what a character arc is this transformation of that core belief. You know, it's something that we connect a lot to identity, but ultimately it comes down to one aspect of something that they hold sacred. And it's so sacred to them that it forms a picture of who they see themselves to be, the way they interact with the world around them. So I think we've strayed vastly from the question you asked.
Oh, but I love it, yeah.
But I think the real question, like the reason why story is so important with the unconscious is because story is the externalization. It is the conflict. It is the playground that we engage, or the obstacle course that we engage, that pulls our unconscious values out until we have to reckon with them. And that core belief that is rooted in our trunk, you know, if our belief system is a tree, the trunk is those core beliefs from which all the other beliefs branch out from. As we engage a story, we start to see that certain core beliefs are limited. These limiting beliefs that are navigated. We're navigating our whole life by false assumptions, usually from values that we picked up when we were young, when we were children. And as we grow, and that's why so many, anyways, I call this belief the Achilles heel. And every single character arc is kind of constructed around this idea of there's some limiting belief that this character is operating off of. And every time they pursue an objective, they have to confront conflict that forces them to have to look inward. And that forcing them to look inward is what exposes the Achilles heel. It is the limiting belief they're navigating, or they're using to navigate the world. So the transformation, or a character arc, is ultimately the series of conflicts that get them to drop their masks, their pretense of beliefs, until they're forced to accept their sacred belief. And then they experience an epiphany. And the epiphany is ultimately the completion of a character arc. That is when they have adopted a new belief. The epiphany is a birth of a belief. And once they've adopted that new belief, then they take on the transformation, or the completion of the character arc. That ultimately ties into this ancient idea of rites of passage by Arno von Gennep, a folklorist and father of, one of the contributors of anthropology. Talked a lot about that. But so the idea that like story is connected to the unconscious is one of the most important things that we can actually engage when it comes to understanding character. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is I think a lot of this has been lost in a lot of, it seems like the last 10 years or so. There are very few filmmakers who are actually connecting external conflict to internal conflicts. And these internal conflicts are driven by asking them, what is driving this character to act? And the external conflicts push them to have to confront that. And too many times right now, we have so many stories that are, we just have characters who represent the right and characters who represent the wrong. They go in conflict and one wins and one loses. That's ultimately not very revelatory. And I think it's the relationship between the external conflict and the unconscious values that ultimately creates the epiphany in the character, and then ultimately in the audience if they're connected with it.
Well, you know, you often hear too that for the protagonist to have a villain that has equal sort of sets of skills and are almost the same in a lot of ways, but then there's this weird dividing line where one, you know, and they both think that they're doing right.
Yes.
So yeah, that makes sense. And then with taking off the mask, that's the shadow self? That's the part that the person can't see?
So you're getting into Jung. Okay, so it can be, I mean, that's another metaphor, you know? And that's the other thing, let me just say this, like even though this is engaging, you know, representations of the unconscious, I'm posing a premise, I'm positing a theory or a hypothesis that ultimately these characters are composed of these different dimensions of, you know, the conscious desire, the unconscious drive, and the Achilles heel. And by drilling into these, we expose their desire. All of these are metaphorical. In other words, these are visual representations to try and understand what is ultimately the human experience. And the way we understand the human experience is through abstract representations. Everyone does. That's why I think understanding what belief is plays such an important role in the development of story.
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.